Have you ever been alone in the woods after the sun has set? When every rustle make your heart skip a beat, and shadows lengthen, twisting familiar trees into something alien and menacing. The forest is a place of primal power, ancient secrets, and sometimes inexplicable horror. Tonight you will hear 3 stories, 3 blood-curdling tales from those who dared to peer behind the veil of the ordinary and encountered what lurks in the deepest wilderness. Listen closely and try not to be left alone in the dark. Story 1: The Ghosts of Amber Mine. This happened 3 years ago in the fall. I've always been fascinated by abandoned places, especially those shrouded in local legends. Amber Mine, an old copper mine shut down in the early 20th century, had always drawn me. It was located a couple of 100 kilometers from the city, in a dense forest massif, rarely visited by anyone. They said it was restless there, that the shadows of the past still roamed the tunnels. Of course, I was skeptical, but a touch of creepiness added thrill to the upcoming adventure. My plan was simple: get to the location, set up camp near the main mine buildings, and spend a couple of days exploring what was left on the surface, perhaps peeking into the safest-looking entrances to the adits. I wasn't going to go deep. Common sense told me it was dangerous. I had enough gear for 3 days, including a powerful flashlight, spare batteries, a first aid kit, and of course my camera to capture the decay and desolation. The road to Amber Mine was an ordeal in itself. The last 30 kilometers were a battered logging track that gradually dissolved into the forest, becoming a barely noticeable trail. My SUV handled it, but a couple of times I seriously thought I'd have to turn back. When I finally reached the supposed location, the sun was already setting. The forest here was dense, old, with tall pines creating an almost constant gloom beneath their crowns. The air was damp and smelled of decaying leaves and some faint metallic tang. I found a relatively flat spot about 200 meters from the dilapidated wooden structures that once housed the mine administration and workers' barracks. I pitched my tent, built a small fire. The silence around was almost absolute, broken only by the crackling of branches in the fire and the rare hoot of an owl. As darkness fell, the mine ruins took on a particularly sinister appearance. The black voids of windows and doors in the old buildings resembled empty eye sockets. I slept fitfully the first night. I thought I heard sounds, a distant metallic creak or dull thuds, seeming to come from underground. I attributed it to the wind whistling through the ruins, or to fatigue and an overactive imagination. In the morning, after inspecting the surroundings, I found nothing unusual. Only animal tracks, deer, wild boar, no signs of other people. I spent most of the day taking pictures. The ruins were impressive. Remnants of a sorting plant, moss-covered foundations, rusty, narrow-gauge rails disappearing into the dark maws of adits. I stumbled upon a few personal items left by miners almost 100 years ago: a rusted kerosene lamp, a broken clay mug, a few deformed metal buttons. These finds created an oppressive feeling of touching a long-gone era, full of hard labor and perhaps tragedies. Towards evening, I decided to inspect one of the adit entrances. It looked the most preserved. The wooden supports at the entrance, though rotten, were still holding. Armed with my flashlight, I stepped inside. Immediately, I smelled dampness, cold, and that same metallic dust. The flashlight beam snatched wet stone walls from the darkness, covered with whitish mineral streaks. I went in about 20 meters, no more. The adit made a gentle curve, and beyond it was pitch darkness. And then I heard it again. This time, more clearly. A vague whisper, many voices merging into an unintelligible hum. It seemed to come from the depths of the mine. I froze, turned off the flashlight, listening. The whispering continued, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder. It definitely wasn't the wind. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly turned on the flashlight and backed towards the exit. The sunlight felt like salvation. For the rest of the evening, I felt uneasy. The whispering wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to convince myself they were auditory hallucinations caused by the unusual acoustics of the underground or my own tension. But deep down, fear had taken root. When it got dark, I threw more wood on the fire and tried not to look towards the dark openings of the mine. At night, the sounds returned. Now, it wasn't just whispering. I heard distinct footsteps, heavy, measured, as if someone was walking on a wooden platform somewhere near the ruins. Sometimes, a creak was added, like the sound of a poorly oiled wheelbarrow. I sat in my tent, clutching a heavy hunting knife, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it could be heard outside the tent. I didn't dare to look out. Who or what could be making these sounds in an abandoned mine in the middle of the night? At some point, I noticed a faint flickering through the tent fabric from the direction of the mine. It was an uneven, wavering light, like that from a lantern or a candle. It moved, shifting between the ruins. I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. In the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds, I saw a dark figure slowly wandering from one building to another. The figure was tall, hunched, and in its hand, it held something emitting a dim light. I couldn't make out any details, but the very fact of someone else's presence in this god-forsaken place was terrifying. Maybe it was another lone explorer like me, but why was he wandering at night with such a strange light source? And why did he exude such an oppressive feeling? The figure stopped for a moment, turning its head in my direction, as if sensing my gaze. The light swayed. I quickly zipped up the tent and burrowed into my sleeping bag, trying not to breathe. I don't know how much time passed. I lay there, paralyzed by fear, listening to every rustle. The steps and creaking stopped, but now I heard whispering very close, as if someone was standing right behind the tent and muttering something in an unfamiliar, guttural language. Then, something slowly scraped against the tent fabric. Once, then again. I would have screamed, but my voice was stuck in my throat. Suddenly, everything went quiet. Absolute silence, even more eerie than the previous sounds. I lay like that until the first signs of dawn, not daring to move. When the sky in the east began to lighten, I dared to look out. There was no one around. The fire had almost burned out. Only my footprints were visible on the ground. I quickly packed my things without even having breakfast, threw my backpack into the car, and drove away from Amber Mine as fast as I could. On the way, I stopped several times to catch my breath. I was shaking. I couldn't find a rational explanation for what had happened. Was it just my frayed nerves? Or did something sinister really inhabit the old mine? I looked at the photos I had taken. In one of the pictures, taken at the entrance to the Adit where I heard the whispering, something barely discernible was visible in the depths of the dark passage. Two dim pinpoints of light, like eyes, staring straight into the lens. I deleted that photo, and I never went back to Amber Mine. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, I still think I hear that distant, unintelligible whisper, and cold terror grips me again. I don't know what it was, and frankly, I don't want to know. Some doors are best left unopened. Story 2, The Guardian of Wolf's Hollow. This happened about 5 years ago when I was working as a seasonal warden at a remote station in a large national park. The place was called Wolf's Hollow, a vast, wild gorge overgrown with ancient firs and spruces, where human feet rarely trod. My job mainly consisted of patrolling the territory, keeping track of animals and maintaining a small cabin that served as my home for several months. I was used to solitude and loved the wilderness, so I enjoyed this work. The first few weeks passed calmly. I studied the routes, observed deer, foxes, and once even saw a mother bear with her cubs. The forest lived its usual life. But then strange things started to happen. At first, they were minor. Sometimes, returning to the cabin, I noticed that things were not as I had left them. A mug moved, a book opened to a different page. I attributed it to my own forgetfulness. Then I started finding strange signs around the cabin, small pyramids of stones that definitely weren't there before, or branches tied in a peculiar way, forming some kind of symbols. This no longer seemed like animal mischief. I began to suspect that someone else was in my area. Poachers, perhaps? But I found no other signs of their presence. No campfires, no trash, no traps. One day, during a patrol, I stumbled upon a fresh bedding spot in a dense thicket. It was clearly man-made, flattened grass, a few broken branches. But what was strangest was the strong, pungent, somehow primal smell emanating from this place, a mixture of sweat, damp earth, and something else, unfamiliar and unpleasant. I felt an inexplicable anxiety. Whoever it was, they definitely didn't want to be seen. At night, I started hearing sounds. First, it was the cracking of branches near the cabin, as if someone was walking around. Then, a quiet cough or something like a guttural growl. I would go out with a flashlight but see no one. Only the shadows of trees dancing in the beam. I didn't have a dog. It wasn't encouraged at the station, so as not to disturb the wild animals. Now, I regretted it. The creepiest part began when I started finding gifts on my cabin doorstep. One morning, it was a dead field mouse, neatly placed on the step. The next day, a bunch of some herbs tied with a strip of rawhide. Then, a bird feather stuck in the door crack. It looked like some kind of ritual offerings. I removed them, trying not to touch them with my bare hands, and with each one I felt increasingly uneasy. I reported my observations to base via radio. They told me it was probably some local eccentric or hermit, and advised me to be careful but not to panic. They couldn't send help, the area was too remote, and there was no real threat yet. I stepped up my precautions. I always bolted the door, even when I went out briefly, always carried my knife, and the rifle, which usually hung on the wall, now stood loaded by my bed. One evening, I was sitting by the window reading a book. It was already dark, but the moon was shining brightly. Suddenly, I heard a sound very close to the window, like heavy breathing. I froze. Then, there was a soft scraping sound on the glass. I slowly raised my head and looked at the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. Behind the glass, literally inches from my face, was another face. It was dark, weathered, overgrown with a thick matted beard. The eyes burned with some wild, inhuman fire. On its head was a cap made of some animal's fur with ears sticking out. The creature, I couldn't call it human, was pressed against the glass, examining me. Its lips moved, but I heard no sounds. I recoiled sharply, grabbed the rifle. When I looked at the window again, it was empty. I rushed outside, but all around was silence and emptiness. Only the moonlight flooded the clearing in front of the cabin. I walked around the house but found no tracks other than my own. I became truly terrified. This was not just an eccentric. This was something wild, primal. For the next few days, I lived on edge, constantly listening to every rustle, sleeping in snatches, rifle in hand. The gifts stopped appearing, but I felt a constant, unseen presence. It seemed to me that I was being watched from the forest, from behind every tree. I tried to leave the cabin less often, only when absolutely necessary. The climax came a week later. It was a dark, moonless night. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard someone jiggling the doorknob. I jumped up, grabbed the rifle. The door was locked with a massive bolt, but whoever was outside didn't give up. They pulled harder, then started pounding on the door with fists or something heavy. The cabin shook from the blows. I shouted for them to go away, threatened to shoot. In response, there was a low, guttural snarl that made my hair stand on end. It was not a human voice. Then the pounding stopped. Silence fell. I stood in the middle of the room, trembling, not knowing what to expect. Suddenly, I heard a crackling sound on the roof. Something heavy was moving up there. Then there was a scraping sound, as if someone was trying to pry off boards or break through the roof. I realized they were trying to get inside. I fired upwards, into the ceiling. The roar of the shot in the small room deafened me. The scraping on the roof stopped. For a moment there was silence, and then I heard something heavy jump from the roof to the ground and crash loudly into the forest. I didn't sleep until morning. As soon as it dawned, I contacted base and demanded immediate evacuation. I told them what had happened. This time, they believed me. A few hours later, a helicopter arrived. As I flew away, I looked down at Wolf's Hollow. The forest stretched to the horizon, wild, indifferent, guarding its secrets. Later, I learned that there were indeed legends in those parts about a master of the forest, or forest man, a wild creature that supposedly protected its domain from outsiders. Most people considered these just tall tales for tourists, but I know what I saw, and I'm sure it was something more than just a hermit, something ancient and very dangerous. Since then, I try to stay away from places that are too remote and wild. Sometimes I still feel its gaze on me from the darkness of the forest. Story 3, The Trail of Shadows. This was 2 years ago, late spring. I decided to hike solo along a little-known trail that locals called the Trail of Shadows. It led through an old abandoned mountain range where there were once small logging settlements, but now it was completely desolate. The route wasn't officially marked, and maps of it were quite approximate. That's what attracted me. I wanted to test myself, to be alone with nature far from civilization. I was planning on a 4 to 5 day trip. The beginning of the hike was wonderful. The weather was sunny, the forest filled with birdsong, and the scent of spring flowers. I walked along a barely noticeable path that sometimes climbed slopes, sometimes descended into shady hollows. For the first 2 days, I didn't meet a soul, which suited me fine. I camped in a tent, cooked food on a small gas stove. On the 3rd day, the atmosphere began to change. The forest became denser, gloomier. Old, gnarled trees covered in moss and lichen created the feeling that I had entered some kind of fairy tale, but unkind world. The trail became even less distinct, and I increasingly had to check my compass and GPS navigator. I began to notice that it had become unnervingly quiet around. The birdsong had disappeared. Not even the rustle of leaves could be heard, although there seemed to be a light breeze. By the evening of the 3rd day, I felt an inexplicable fatigue and slight malaise. I decided to set up camp early in a small clearing by a stream. While pitching the tent, I thought I caught some movement out of the corner of my eye in the thicket of the forest. I turned sharply, but saw nothing. Only dense bushes and dark tree trunks. I put it down to fatigue. I slept badly that night. I had disturbing, confusing dreams. And just before dawn, I woke up with a strange sensation. It felt as if someone was standing next to the tent, looking at me. I lay still, listening. There were no sounds. but this feeling of presence was so strong that a chill ran down my spine. I cautiously peered out of the tent. It was empty all around, only the pre-dawn fog creeping over the clearing. When I started packing my things, I noticed something strange. My boots, which I had left at the entrance of the tent, had been moved. Not much, just a few centimeters, but I remembered exactly how I had placed them. And also, on the ground next to them was a blurred print, not resembling an animal track. It was elongated and somehow shapeless. I couldn't understand what it was, and tried not to pay attention to it, although an unpleasant feeling remained. That day, walking became even harder. The trail had practically disappeared, and I was pushing through dense undergrowth, navigating by map and sun. The forest around seemed hostile. The silence was oppressive. I increasingly found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me. The feeling of being watched never left me. By noon, I reached an old, abandoned logging site. A few half-rotten logs, remnants of some structure, overgrown with grass. And here I saw something that made me stop. Strange symbols were carved on one of the logs. They didn't resemble letters or any runes I knew. They were some kind of winding lines, dots, and spirals. They looked fresh, as if carved very recently. Near this log, I found something else. A small pouch made of coarse fabric, tied with a string. I cautiously untied it. Inside were dried berries, a few small bones of an unknown animal, and a small, smooth black stone. I was overcome with a feeling of disgust and fear. What was this? Someone's rituals? Or did someone leave this specifically for me? I dropped the pouch and hurried away from that place. Panic began to set in. I was no longer thinking about the beauty of nature or testing myself. I wanted to get out of this forest as quickly as possible. I quickened my pace, almost running, not paying attention to the path. Branches whipped my face. My feet got tangled in roots. Suddenly, I heard the crack of branches behind me. I turned sharply. A few dozen meters away between the trees, a dark shadow flickered. It was tall and moved very quickly, silently. I didn't get a good look at it. It immediately disappeared behind the trunks, but I was sure it wasn't an animal. I ran, just ran as fast as I could, ignoring the scratches and fatigue. Adrenaline pushed me forward. I heard the shadow or shadows pursuing me. I didn't see them, but I heard their movement. A light rustle, the crackle of branches to my right, then to my left. They were keeping up. Sometimes I thought I heard their breathing or some quiet muttering. I don't know how long I ran like that. The forest around me blurred into a solid green-brown mass. My lungs burned. My heart was ready to burst from my chest. At some point, I tripped over a root and fell, hitting my knee hard. The pain was sharp, but fear was stronger. I tried to get up, but my leg wouldn't obey. And then I saw them. Two figures slowly emerged from behind the trees. They were tall, very thin, dressed in some dark rags that blended with the forest shadows. Their faces were hidden by hoods or were simply in deep shadow, but I felt their gaze. They didn't approach, just stood and looked at me. A wave of cold and some primal dread emanated from them. I screamed. I don't know what exactly, just a cry of despair and terror. The figures didn't flinch. I crawled backward, pushing with my hands, not taking my eyes off them. They slowly, very slowly, began to move towards me. Their movements were somehow smooth, unnatural, as if they were gliding above the ground. And then, when I thought it was all over, I heard a dog barking in the distance. And then, a man's voice shouting something. The figures stopped. They turned their heads towards the sound, then looked back at me. For a moment, I thought I saw the glint of eyes in the shadow of their hoods, and then they simply dissolved, disappeared, as if they had never been there. A few minutes later, a man with a rifle and a large dog ran into the clearing. It was a local gamekeeper who had heard my screams. He helped me up, examined my leg. I tried to explain what I had seen, but my words were jumbled. He said that strange people, hermits or cultists, sometimes roamed these parts, but what I described didn't resemble anything he knew. The gamekeeper led me out of the forest. I never finished my route. Back home, I couldn't recover for a long time. What were these creatures? Ghosts of old loggers? Some unknown inhabitants of the deep forest? Or a figment of my imagination, pushed to the limit by fatigue and fear? I don't know, but since then I avoid wild, deserted places. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the silence, I feel like I see those dark, silent figures again, watching me from the shadows. The Trail of Shadows had lived up to its name.